So without more ado, over to you. Thank you very much, Rudi.
Right, well, good evening, everybody. It's very kind to be invited back, thank you, and thank you all for attending. I'm going to start, before we actually get into this, by breaking a couple of the golden rules of public speaking. This is actually the first presentation I've given via Zoom, so I ask for your forbearance in case there's any technicalities. And by the same token, considering the subject matter of tonight, hopefully we won't have any failures of technology. So without any more ado, let's bring up the PowerPoint.
You need to go to screen share.
Yep. There we go. All right, so On a Wing and a Prayer, the British Imperial airship scheme of 1924 to 30. In aviation history, there have been many infamous events. There's been the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, the de Havilland Comet tragedies, and the destruction of the Hindenburg. But there is one event of major significance that holds a strange state in the public psyche. On one side, it appears well remembered, the subject of museum exhibits, being referenced in Doctor Who and Monty Python, being the basis of an experimental rock opera, and even still having an impact on the landscape of Bedfordshire. But conversely, very few people appear to have heard of it, or know the details of what was, at one point, Britain's most publicised engineering project. I therefore intend to present an introduction to the British Imperial airship scheme of 1924 and His Majesty's airships R100 and R101. Now, the development of the airship, the feasible transport technology, owes its origins to Graf Ferdinand von Zeppelin and the groundbreaking LZ-1 of 1900. Balloons were a tried and tested technology, such as the Giffard dirigible of 1852. An experimental craft filled with a lighter than air gas, such as hydrogen, had flown previously. But Zeppelin's designs were essentially the first successful, fully rigid structures, despite some early issues proved to be substantially more effective than any preceding. Rapidly, his ideas were copied, and many nations began constructing their own military airships, this usage being Zeppelin's original intention. Today, airship and Zeppelin are synonymous terms, but really they were no such thing, the latter solely applying to airships built by the Zeppelin Company of Friedrichshafen. As such, most of the Zeppelins which attacked Britain during World War I were not actually Zeppelin. Furthermore, the term airship, or more technically dirigible, from the French for directable, is itself a generic name, encompassing 3 different types of airframe. Most common today are non-rigid designs or blimps, whereby the external shape is maintained solely by gas pressure. Second are semi-rigid airships. Although mostly dependent on gas pressure, these have a structural cue for rigidity. This particular example, British Army Dirigible No. 1, named Nulli Secundus, second to none, by King George V, was Britain's first airship, built in 1907. Lastly, we have rigid airships, type most associated with the 1920s and 30s. These consisted of a linen-clad framework, often made of steel or an aluminium manganese alloy dubbed duralumin, inside of which were multiple gas bags. It was this rigid design that the R in later British airship names stood for. British rigid airship construction began with HMA No. 1, most airship Mayfly, completed in 1911 in direct competition with Germany. She was never flown. A handling error when being taken out of her shed caused her delicate structure to snap. Lessons were learned, though. Many rigid and non-rigid ships were constructed and tested, culminating in the R-33 of 1919. Converted for civilian use in 1920, but later returning to military duty as an experimental flying aircraft carrier, he ultimately had a 10-year career, her gondola now preserved at RAF Hendon. Her sister, the R-34, became the first airship to cross the Atlantic. These vessels, as with all airships, did have limitations. being particularly vulnerable to storms and, more specifically, shifting winds placing stress on their frames. Many ships around the world suffered structural failures as a consequence. With increasing size, the problems grew, as frames had to be built strong enough to counter this, but also be lightweight, hence the development of duralumin. The use of hydrogen furthered the danger, sparks from engines and static being a constant fear. Production in sufficient quantities of the safer helium only began in America in 1921, but they refused to sell it to other nations in fear it would be used for military purposes. These issues were on the 24th of August 1921. After the war, America had decided to adopt rigid airships, and in 1919 had purchased the part-built R-38 from the British government. Completed in early 1921, it was to be tested with an Anglo-American crew before being handed over to the US Navy as the ZR-2. Found to have problems with its controls and design in general, several midship girders required repairing after only just a couple of flights. On her fifth flight, while flying in fair weather offshore near Hull, she suffered a complete structural failure, snapping in two. As she fell, the forward section exploded and the wreck crashed into the Humber, killing 44. The three inquiries also concluded that the design failed to consider aerodynamic stresses, and the manoeuvres performed during tests had weakened the hull. Citing financial reasons, the British government had already cancelled airship development on the 31st of May 1921, and with this high-profile incident, it was thought that the British construction of airships had come to an end. But not for long. By July 1921, there was already discussions about reinstigating an airship program. A.H. Ashbolt, the Agent General for Tasmania, first proposed an Imperial airship company. At this time, long-haul heavier-than-air flight was simply unfeasible. Stalling, in 1922, Denniston Burney from the Vickers Company, which had built many of the early British airships, suggested a commercial British Empire passenger service. Again, looked at favourably, it lingered until the 1924 general election, a minority win by Ramsay MacDonald and Labour. Their new Minister of Air, Lord Christopher Thompson, credited this plan as feasible, but the proposed finances ended on a government loan calculated as requiring at least 60 years in order to pay off. Therefore, he instead proposed a new government scheme, intended to last for 3 years and cost £1,200,000, the Imperial Airship Scheme. Forming two technical advisory bodies, it would operate a series of intended routes across Canada, Africa, India, and Australia, notably creating major overseas airship stations at Montreal and Karachi. Most importantly, and clearly building upon the previous proposals, the question of funding or monopolising numerous airships was resolved by initiating a revolutionary competition. Initially, there were to be two ships, one built by the government and another by private enterprise, namely the Vickers Company. Any subsequent contracts would go to the builders of the most superior airship. Pausing for a moment, some words are necessary on the Minister of Air, Lord Thompson. Born in India in 1875 to a military family, he became an officer in the Royal Engineers and served in the Second Boer War, during which he was placed to a balloon section, triggering a great interest in aviation. Rising through the ranks, he served in the Great War, both at the front and behind the lines as a military attaché. Thompson became part of the British delegation at Versailles, but condemned the treaty as, quote, containing the seeds of another war. Leaving the army, he decided to enter politics, but despite standing as a Labour candidate 3 times, failed to win a seat. Ramsay MacDonald, however, wanted Thompson on his cabinet, therefore had him elevated to the peerage as Baron Thompson of Cardington, Bedfordshire. Strategically, this was the site of the government's airship works, which I shall explain shortly. Taking the position of Minister of Air, the 1924 minority government collapsed after 11 months, being replaced by Stanley Baldwin's Conservative cabinet. It was only in the 1929 election that MacDonald returned with his second minority administration, and Thompson was again made Minister of Air. As said, 2 ships were to be constructed, one public. Designated R100 and R101, they were quickly nicknamed the capitalist ship and the socialist ship. The largest airships yet constructed, R100 was intended to be of comparatively traditional design, while R101 was essentially an experimental craft using new innovations. Future airships would thus merge the best features of each. While of radically different designs, each was ordered to fit the same specifications, namely passenger accommodation for 100, capacity for 16 tons of cargo, and to carry fuel sufficient for 57 hours flight at a cruising speed of 63 miles per hour. Their final acceptance into passenger service was dependent on completing test flights to India. Concentrating on R100 first, she was designed and built by the Airship Guarantee Company, a dedicated subsidiary of the Vickers Company, at their specialist facility at Howden in Yorkshire. Although planning began immediately, delays meant construction only commenced in 1927, and the fixed cost laid out by the government, some £471,113, meant the construction project was expected to make a loss right from the start. As a consequence, she was designed with the intention of using as few machine tools and as few different components as possible, while her construction shed was unheated and leaked, in part leading to a number of strikes throughout construction. With difficulty in finding skilled workers, most were locals who were trained on the job. Her chief designer was an experienced airship engineer with Vickers, who would ultimately become a household name for very different aeronautics. Barnes Wallis of Wellington bomber and bouncing bomb fame. While most known for these, he was first and foremost an airship man, his study still containing mementos. Another noteworthy designer was Neville Shute Norway, who later became known as a major novelist. Working as a stress engineer, coincidentally, his 1948 novel, No Highway, inadvertently predicted the de Havilland comet disasters 6 years before they occurred. With a length of 719 feet and a diameter of 133 feet, R100 had the volume capacity for 5 million cubic feet of hydrogen. Weighing 105 tons empty, with a total lift of 150 tons, she could carry a payload of ballast, fuel, passengers, and cargo weighing 45 tons. Her main structure consisted of 16 longitudinal girders formed from duralumin tubes running between 15 polygonal transverse frames. These frames were held in shape by wire braces connected to a central longitudinal girder running the length of the ship. The 15 gas bags utilized Zeppelin-designed gas valves, but their bracing wires were to a revolutionary geodectic design by Wallis that would later inspire the airship fuselages in his Wellesley, Wellington, and Windsor bombers. Forming the outer hull or envelope was a cover of linen fabric painted with aluminium aircraft coat. Excuse me. In terms of propulsion, plans changed several times throughout construction, which was a stop-start affair as it closely followed each stage of the design process. Originally, she was to have engines fueled by hydrogen and kerosene, but these were insufficiently developed, so attention turned to diesel engines. Those that were intended were too heavy and unreliable, so Wallis decided to use 6 modified Rolls-Royce Condor aero engines. Fueled by petrol and requiring a greater volume, this was considered a higher risk in tropical conditions, leading to the final test route being changed to Canada instead of India. The engines were fitted in 3 gondolas, 2 apiece, with the rear pusher engines fitted with reversing gear docking. Intentions were to modify the engines back to kerosene once more developed. While meant to be a traditional design, Wallis made much of R100 quite experimental. Aside from her structure and wiring, her physical shape was the first properly aerodynamic airship and the first with internal passenger accommodation. Wallis also devised a number of additional operating systems, such as rainwater collection devices along the top of the ship to restock ballast en route. In terms of passenger accommodation, entry to the ship was via a doorway in the bow leading to an electrically lit corridor. Slightly forward of centre inside the hull was an enclosed three-storey structure comprising an upper deck with cabins, lounge balcony and promenade balconies. Main deck with kitchen, dining room, conveniences, promenades and more cabins. And the crew deck containing their accommodation. Beneath this externally was the control gondola from where the ship was operated. With panoramic windows from the promenade and the staircase, the passenger provisions were an unusual blend of Spartan and luxury, the result of balancing amenities provided versus incumbent weight. An issue with all airships, R100 was nonetheless described as, quote, intermediate in comfort between a Pullman train and an ocean liner. Having noted strikes, limited resources and slow methodical designing, it was only by 1929 that R100 was completed, having taken 3 years. Her first flight took place on the 16th of December 1929 from Howden via York, Cardington. Running on 5 engines, the 6th having a cracked water jacket, the journey took 5 hours, 47 minutes. The next day, she undertook a 6.5-hour trial. This would have been a flight to London. However, a section of covering detached from the lower fin, so instead they just flew around Cardington. She was then shedded and her cover wiring examined over December. By the end of January 1930, R100 had completed 5 flights, including her first to London on the 20th, and a 54-hour flight over southeast England via the Channel Islands on the 29th. She had also achieved a personal best speed of 81.5 miles per hour. At this point, she was given new upgraded Condor engines, and a few cabins were removed to reduce weight. Her return to flight was delayed by a gust damaging her tail while leaving the shed, ironically timed as it occurred when the German airship Graf Zeppelin was visiting England, though limiting publicity and denying famed designer Dr. Hugo Echner of the Zeppelin Company a ride. R100 next flew on the 21st of May, when checks were made of the modifications. It had been planned to have her maiden voyage to Canada on the 25th, but her flight on the 21st of May had led to the tapered tail breaking, requiring further repairs as it was removed, reducing her overall length to 709 feet. With a further test flight to check these repairs, her maiden voyage was finalised for late July. She was officially handed over the Air Ministry. At 2:48 a.m. the 29th of July 1930, R100 departed Cardington bound for Montreal. Her commander was Squadron Leader Ralph Booth, in command of a collective crew of 36. Outward bound, there were only 6 passengers, including Wing Commander Reginald Colmore, the Director of Airship Development, and Major George Scott, the Superintendent of Flying Operations. All was well until the next day, when a sudden squall caused some damage to the fins, and repairs had to be made mid-flight. A more significant storm was forecast in their path over the St. Lawrence River, but Major Scott directed that they should fly straight through it. Despite R100 having never been tested in adverse weather, Squadron Leader Booth did not counter the request. Shortly after entering it, a blast wind forced the airship upwards 1,800 feet in a single minute, before another gust lifted them another 1,000 in barely 15 seconds, some 45 miles an hour vertically. In trying to combat the ascents, R100's elevators were lowered, causing the airship to tilt steeply downwards. As rapidly as it had begun, she returned to an even keel and was soon out of the storm, bearing a massive tear to the lower side of the starboard fin. Nonetheless, she arrived safely in Montreal at 5:37 a.m., having travelled 3,364 miles in 78 hours, 49 minutes. While the flight had revealed continuing teething troubles, the voyage was seen as a triumph and a publicity coup. The crew were invited to receptions and banquets, while R100 undertook a 26-hour local flight to Quebec with officials. She was a sensation, being praised wherever she went, and having over 100,000 visitors daily over her 12-day stay. She departed for home on the 13th of August, loaded with 13 passengers, including 9 journalists. With one engine out of action and water ingress shorting the electric cooker, the 3 return journey was not the most comfortable. But there were no major difficulties, and she arrived at Cardington on the 16th of August. Thereafter, she was scheduled for inspection as attention and crew members turned to the voyage of her sister. By this time, she had collectively travelled 11,135 miles in 10 flights, with a total flying time of 294 hours, 10 minutes, the equivalent of 12 and a quarter days. Circumstances would mean she would never fly again. As is plain, R100 was not a glowing success. Aside from teething troubles, her outer cover was barely adequate in operation. Insufficiently supported, it rippled badly in flight, increasing the chances of tearing. As a consequence, her speed was limited to 70 miles an hour. By the time she returned from Canada, her cover and gas bags were life expired. Then there was the issue of aerodynamic forces snapping the tail, despite rigorous calculations and wind tunnel testing. This was hardly helped by insufficient poor weather tests. More fundamentally, she failed to conform to the requirements of the project. She was slightly too heavy, with underpowered engines, reducing her lift and thus potential payload to below the minimum stipulated, that being 63 tons, including 20 tons of service load, ballast and crew. Furthermore, weight had been saved to an extent by the use of petrol engines, despite diesels being stipulated, preventing Indian usage. But it would be unfair to criticise too harshly for these. Limited payload was known even before she first flew, and to her credit, she more than compensated with her impressive speed, even if her maximum caused the cover to ripple excessively. What Wallace built, by his own admission, was a prototype with the aim of learning from experiment. R100 would never have realistically made a commercial service. She was simply there to pave the way technically to larger future airships. Indeed, she was expected to undergo a major refit and enlargement as it was. More importantly, she was built on such a restrictive budget that every penny had to be saved, and there was no room for prior research. Excluding the storm incidents brought about by the questionable experience of Major Scott, her flights were relatively free from incident. It should be noted that Scott had previously handled smaller airships, but was out of experience and unused to larger ships, having previously caused several prior landing accidents. Therefore, all things concerned, despite her flaws, R100 and Wallace rightly deserve praise for what they achieved. Although R100 had been built in Howden, she was ultimately based at Cardington, near Bedford. The establishment here was originally built by the Short Brothers Company in 1915, comprising Shed Number 1, construction workshops, a gas works supplying hydrogen, and the workers' housing estate named Shortstown. Nationalised in 1919 and renamed the Royal Airship Works. This was mothballed in 1921, but fortunately it was not sold. Many modifications were made to the site for the Imperial Airship scheme, including extending Shed Number 1 for R101, erecting Shed 2, formerly at Pulham Air Base, for R100, and constructing a new mooring mast. Costing £50,000, this mast was 202 feet high and featured a spiral staircase, lift, winches, and underground fuel tanks. The first cantilever mooring mast to be built, it could withstand a pulling force of 30 tons in any direction. Similar masts were built at Montreal, at Ismailia in Egypt, and at the Indian terminus at Karachi, which also gained a shed, the largest building in the British Empire. German airships, by comparison, were designed to work off the ground, only requiring masts for ground manoeuvre. The developments at Cardington made it the national centre for lighter than air travel. Today, though, all that remain are the great sheds, still dominating the skyline and now often used as film sets, notably the Batman films. 812 feet long, 880 feet wide and 157 feet tall, they are so big that clouds have been known to form inside them. To give a scale comparison, the ocean liners Lusitania and Mauretania could both be placed alongside each other inside one of the sheds, while if done with the Titanic, only 40 feet of her bow would protrude past the doors. Excuse me. Unlike R100, R101 started life at her Cardington base, being built in Shed 1 and developed very different. Unlike the fixed cost given to Vickers, the government lavished resources on their airship, with the final construction cost reaching £711,595, over half as much again as R100. The first 2 years consisted solely of research, costing £305,200 alone. This included stress calculations, designing and testing new types of machinery and equipment, wiring and framework, and testing intended materials, in addition to the actual design work. They even constructed an entire gas cell bay purely to research in-flight stresses, the structure being dismantled immediately after and the frames tested to destruction. Interestingly, the previously mothballed R33 was used as a testbed for the project, adding a further £103,100 to the scheme's cost. Leading the design team was Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Richmond, who had helped devise the criteria for the scheme and was experienced with airships, albeit mostly non-rigid designs. While he was known as R101's designer, he was technically officer in charge of design and research, and although his decision-making was limited by the specifications he had to work within, his control of the design process was easily comparable to Wallace, the inquiry reports describing him as, quote, almost autocratic. Some claimed there was ever-growing rivalry between the two competing groups, hindering development, others strongly denying this. But the fundamental issue was that Britain barely had the expertise to build one airship of this nature, let alone two. To quote one historian, it was a little like starting on a skyscraper without ever having built a house. Vickers was the more attractive option, particularly under Wallace, so gained for better staff. Neville Shute Norway of R100 later recounted that he was, quote, inexpressibly shocked that the R101 design team was essentially the same as that for the ill-fated and poorly designed R38. Measuring 730 long, 131 feet, R101's design was indeed revolutionary. For additional strength, her structure was primarily made of stainless steel, with lesser use of duralumin. The individual girders were designed and built by Bolton and Paul of Norwich and transported to Cardington, where they were bolted together. She was made up of 20 transverse ring frames with 15 connecting longitudinal girders. But unlike previous airships requiring substantial wire bracing, these rings were entirely self-supporting through their triangular form. Being thicker overall as a result, they did, however, reduce the size of the 16 gas bags. Along with longitudinal support girders, there were also 15 intermediate longitudinals intended solely to support the outer cover. This cover was equally radical, Richmond experimenting with fitting pre-doped linen. His enthusiasm towards perfecting this process led to him being given the nickname of Dope. Originally, R101 had a total weight of 113 tons and a total lift of 148 tons. This only gave 35 tons of useful lift, as opposed to the 63 tons required. And when removing the serving load of 18 tons of ballast, this resulted in a maximum payload of only 17 tons. When then adding crew and fuel, not to mention provisions, passengers and luggage, there simply was not enough lift. A major issue this point would return to haunt the project. Whereas R100 had turned to petrol engines against stipulated requirements, R101 used the diesels intended for the purpose. Having 5 engines in total, these were positioned 2 aside and 1 aft centrally, pushing propellers facing to the rear. While 7 of a different design were used for initial measurements, the 5 fitted were Beardmore Tornado aero engines. These had 8 cylinders and were developed for R101 by doubling up pre-existing railcar engine designs. Working at 650 RPM instead of 1,000, and weighing 3.5 tons each, they were 450 RPM slower and collectively 6 tons heavier than intended. Ironically, all bar 1 retained a small petrol starter engine. They were also prone to vibrations that destroyed the original reversible propellers. These were replaced with fixed wooden props, forcing the forward port engine propeller to be fitted backwards to enable reverse. In flight, that engine was therefore a dead weight, further reducing the overall power. This system astonished the R100 designers, who had previously rejected these diesels in their own airship, and later two engines had modifications to run them backwards when necessary. Turning to passenger accommodation, R101 was intended to be as luxurious as possible, but the overall layout changed substantially throughout the design phase and with later modifications. Having two decks, the uppermost contained passenger accommodation, lounge, dining room, and promenades. The lower deck housed washrooms, galley, cruise quarters, including radio room, cargo hold, and the first ever airship smoking room, asbestos lined to be fireproof. As with R100, there was an external control gondola, and passenger access was via a corridor from the bow. Much was done to save weight. Walls were white painted canvas, pillars were hollow around structural members, most furniture was wickerwork with inflatable cushions, and cooking utensils were aluminium. Originally having 50 bunk bed cabins, electric lighting was installed. There was a full heating system, and the dining room even had a dumbwaiter lift to the galley below. Quoting one reporter, R101 will provide luxuries undreamt of by Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. It will positively be an aerial hotel. These were not the only innovations. Lacking frame braces, a new method of gas bag suspension kept supporting the bag akin to parachute wiring. New automatic gas relief valves were designed, fitted either side of each bag, with air vents at the bow, preventing any buildup of gas internally by allowing a continual flow of air. Ballast and fuel tanks were linked via a compressed air system, allowing trimming of the vessel while in flight, while the fuel tanks were designed to be capable of jettisoning in an emergency, either by dropping the physical tank or by cutting the base off with a mechanism like a can opener. The rudders and elevator controls were assisted by servo gear, while miniature propellers drove electric generators while in flight. These and other ideas, though, were completely untested. When visiting, Dr. Eckner declared that R101 heralded a new breed of exceptional ship. Previously, though, when first seeing the plans, he is purported to have said, quote, "Very nice, but isn't it a little big?" For good and bad, R101 was truly revolutionary. She was finally completed in 1929, behind schedule as with R100. Coincidentally, this was after Labour returned to power, so Thompson didn't miss out on any of the test flights, and he was particularly keen to publicise his ship. On the 14th of October 1929, R101 first took to the skies, undertaking a return flight over London, albeit on only two engines. Even before this flight, it was known the weight problem would prevent a passage to India. Higher temperatures would reduce lift further by up to 11 tons, and as such, she may not have been even able to carry sufficient fuel, let alone passengers on top. While working out a solution, tests were continued, a second flight being on the 18th of October over the Midlands, lasting 9 hours, 38 minutes. A successful flight, it was only marred by Scott insisting on mooring the airship himself and messing it up twice, and overshooting the mast and tangling the mooring lines. Nonetheless, Thompson declared to the press, quote, "I have rarely had a more pleasant experience. There is a feeling of complete detachment and security." He did emphasize the experimental nature of the entire scheme, however, noting that this was only the early stages. Over November, she undertook 5 flights across England, notably over the Norwich works of Bolton and Paul, where her girders had been made. Varying in duration and with engine difficulties, some of these flights had carried dignitaries, 40 including the Mayor of Bedford on the 8th, 32 on the 14th including MPs and the Director of Civil Aviation, Sir Sefton Branca, while a lunch for 100 MPs was held on board on the 23rd. She was once even visited by the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VIII, almost so to speak. Her fastest run in this period was 67.5 miles per hour. The last November flight was on the 18th, an endurance test aimed to last at least 36 hours. Flying 1,148 miles over Scotland, Ireland, and the Midlands, it actually lasted 30 hours, 41 minutes. Shortly afterwards, he disappeared from public view for a major refit, lasting from the 30th of November 1929 to the 23rd of June 1930. Desperate to increase her lift, 12 passenger cabins, 2 lavatories, 2 ballast tanks, and all promenade window glass were removed, the latter replaced with cell-on cellulose, while other windows were just blanked off. And the new servo gear operating her controls was also taken off. Most importantly, the wiring holding the gas bags in place was slackened, allowing the bags to swell and contain more hydrogen, an additional 104,761 cubic feet. On the 26th of June 1930, she returned to test flight, the following 2 days having involvement in the prestigious RAF display at Hendon. As the so-named socialist airship, the public took great interest throughout the project. Thompson had achieved spectacular publicity, with flights being for publicity as much as engineering, in some cases more so, hence destinations being essentially a national core. As the passenger numbers showed, everyone wanted a piece of the action. R101 regularly appeared in newspapers and film reels. There were also being adverts, medallions, postcards, toys, and photographs. Over 1 million people descended on Cardington just to watch her from the road, snarling up the local traffic. Throughout construction, each new technical advance was heralded in the press, making it awkward to remove later. Coupled with the limitations placed on Richmond by the specifications and Thompson's enthusiastic meddling, the publicity began to be a hindrance, expectations being increasingly raised. The press were besotted. Indeed, R101 was a beautiful ship, but it was rapidly found that unfortunately, she flew like a pig. Many unexpected difficulties arose, all of them major. After the R38 disaster, the government had feared another structural failure. So in their 1924 Committee for the Safety of Airships, created strict parameters for design. While some standards were only finalised late in the project, the basic requirement was for the gas bags to be secured to the transverse frames, not the longitudinal girders, hence the new parachute wiring on R101 and Wallace's geodectic wiring on R100. But Richmond went further with R101, using these self-supporting transverse frames. These increased weight and decreased gas bag size, resulting in the aforementioned weight problem. Simply put, R101 was carrying around several tons of extraneous metal. Then the engines were problematic, being overweight, underpowered, and unreliable. It would have been logical just to remove them. As the government's ship, they were not in a position to ignore the government's requirements, unlike Wallace, especially as Richmond had actively helped create them in the first place. Furthermore, while the servo gear was a success, if heavy, it surprised the R100 designers who had no need of it in their own ship. As said, various modifications were made to lighten the airship, notably expanding the gas bags. But this had consequences of its own. During flight, it was found that the gas bags increasingly surged backwards and forth inside the hull, reducing stability even when stationary. The relief valves were found to be very sensitive and leaked gas, the surging worsening the issue. Worse still, the bags rubbed against the frames, again increasing with the expansion and surging. With some 4,000 protruding bolts, holes were worn in the fabric and even more gas leaked, further reducing lift. It should be noted that in an age of developing synthetic fabrics, the gas bags on both airships were made from canvas covered with gold beater's skin, the outer membrane of cow intestines. Around 1 million Chicago cattle went into R101, and understandably the material, most well known as the casing of sausages, was not known for its strength. Collectively, all of these issues made controlling her ever more difficult. As an example, while at Hendon, R101 was seen by 150,000 people who were highly impressed when she dipped her bow in salute to the king. Unfortunately, this triggered a sudden crash dive, falling 500 feet, and she only recovered thanks to the quick actions of the coxswain. On the previous flight, she had even been forced to dump 2 tons of fuel, to the chagrin of the farmer beneath at the time. Clearly in need of desperate measures, those already completed were not the only ones planned. entering the shed again from the 29th of June until the 1st of October 1930. To mitigate chafing, 4,000 cushions were fitted to exposed frame areas and the gas bags overhauled, while 2 engines were adapted to be directional, as previously stated. But the biggest job, delayed from 29 while appropriate parts were manufactured, was the most radical modification possible. Urgently needing lift and running out of things to remove, they cut R101 in half. Once severed, a new gas bag and bay was assembled amidships, bringing her total volume up to 5,509,753 cubic feet of hydrogen. Alton and Paul should be credited that throughout this complex procedure, there was not a single misfitting girder. Increased in length to 777 feet, R101 still remains the largest aircraft ever built in Britain. Having an increased weight of 118 tons versus an increased lift of 167 tons, she produced 49 tons of useful lift, 14 tons more than before. Finally, she could get to India, on paper at least. Now, this may all sound very unhealthy, but unbelievably, there was an even bigger problem. R100 had shown several issues with her outer cover, but R101 would put these in the shade. Fitted pre-doped, despite testing, it was found to suffer from humidity, tearing when fitting and splitting even before she first left the shed. An inspection on the 20th of January 1930 revealed that by then some areas had accumulated water and actually begun to rot, and even discoloration can actually be seen in this photograph. To repair this, reinforcement bands were glued in place along her length, but this fired spectacularly. Neville Shute Norway of R100 was shown a piece, in his own words. It was ordinary outer cover, linen fabric, silver doped in a red oxide base. On the inner surface, 2-inch tapes had been stuck with some adhesive, evidently for strengthening. I didn't know what I was expected to say and turned it about in my hands. And suddenly, my hand went through it. In parts, it was friable, like scorched brown paper, so that if you crumpled it in your hand, it broke up into flakes. I stared at it in horror, thinking of R100. Good God, where did that come off? He asked, being told by Booth, all right, that's not off our ship, that's off R101. Norway simply replied, I hope they've got all this stuff off the ship. This fault was identified by the R101 team and how it massively reduced the strength of the fabric, the glue having reacted with dope. An inspection on the 2nd of June found many new tears developing. So it was decided to replace the pre-doped cover with a new one, doped afterwards in the traditional way. But this was only to be done after the Hendon flights. In the meantime, it was reinforced further. This plainly didn't help, as shortly before departure, the cover tore twice more, the largest being by 140 feet. Patched again with yet more strengthening bands. When she was extended in length, the cover was finally replaced. Almost. 2 areas which had originally been fitted before doping were deemed acceptable, just forward of the fins and wrapping around the bow. These areas had also been reinforced with glue strips before realising the problem this caused, but as there was no time left to replace them before her October deadline, they were strengthened by patching another layer over them, this time using dope as glue itself. Now, I just mentioned a deadline, the 4th of October 1930 to be precise. Thompson had said that he would defer to the experts on when they thought she would be ready for a long-distance flight. To quote him before the House of Lords in June 1930, "This is one of the most scientific experiments that man has ever attempted. There is going to be no risk while I am in charge. No lives will be sacrificed through lack of foresight and skill." However, he had equally made plain his enthusiasm for a demonstration of success in the form of a long-desired flight to India. Delayed from late September as it was, a number of circumstances would ultimately lead to those very risks. First of these was the successful Canadian flight of R100 in July 1930. With Thompson successfully publicising R101 as the more revolutionary, building expectations, the designers couldn't back down and say she was inferior. They had to show what the public's money had bought. Then there was the start of the October to November 1930 Imperial Conference in London. As a project specifically dealing with communication across the empire, Thompson was adamant that the flight take place, he could report news of its success. Lastly, and in no doubt linked to this through a desire to show his own personal capabilities, Thompson had been asked in private by MacDonald to consider becoming the next Viceroy of India. Had there been no pressure on the builders, it is unlikely she would have flown. But in fairness, it is unlikely that Thompson was told of all the risks, the designers keeping him in the dark. It may be for this reason that despite the poor lift, he requested a 2,630 square foot blue Axminster carpet be fitted in the entrance gangway and lounge, over half a ton of it. In his mind, the time for testing was past. He needed R101 operational and immediately. As MacDonald later wrote of a meeting with Thompson the day before he departed, quote, "He believed in the ship. It was his child. He had watched it grow. How could he stay at home while it went on its way to attainment?" After all these modifications that had been done, most particularly the new cover and extended length, R101 was effectively an untested new airship. So one final trial was squeezed in overnight from the 1st of October. Lasting 16 hours, 51 minutes, despite perfect weather, a faulty engine meant she could not be tested at full speed. Curtailed to give time for preparation, her next flight would be to India. By this point, she had flown a total of 3,970 miles, 119 hours, 47 minutes, equivalent of 5.2 days. Interestingly, the new Air Member for Supply and Research won Hugh Dowding of Fighter Command fame, the passenger on this flight. Trusting the advice of Director Colmore, Dowding recommended a full-speed trial be undertaken early in the maiden voyage itself, rather than delay it. He was, in his own words, responsible for the decision that a special flight for the purpose should not be carried out. Excuse me. On the 4th of October 1930, R101 was scheduled to depart. Her route comprised two halves: Bedford to Ismailia, taking a course over Toulouse and Malta, and once refueled, on to Karachi. She had been loaded with provisions and luggage, amongst which included a cask of ale, 2 cases of champagne, approximately 22 pounds of luggage per each of her passengers, and by request of Thompson, for use at state dinners in Karachi, another carpet. She also carried a silver service set gifted to the airship by the Mayor of Bedford, and to shorten refuelling in Ismailia, an additional 9 tons of diesel fuel. It should be remembered that lift was still such an issue that purportedly biscuits had been removed from tins and parachutes left behind to save weight. Her complement on this maiden voyage was 6 passengers and 48 crew, 54 in total. The dignitaries were important figures in aviation, especially airships. Lord Thompson, Minister of Air; James Buck, Lord Thompson's valet; Air Vice Marshal Sir William Sefton Branca, the Director of Civil Aviation; Major Percy Bishop, Chief Inspector with the Air Inspectorate Department; Squadron Leader Palstra, representing the Australian Government; and Squadron Leader O'Neill, Deputy Director of Civil Aviation India. The remainder comprised 30 hands, 7 petty officers, 11 Royal Airship Works officials. 6 officials technically did not have crew roles, being essentially passengers. Wing Commander Colmore, the Director of Airship Development; Major Scott, Flying Superintendent; designers Lieutenant Colonel Richmond and Squadron Leader Michael Rope; Alexander Bushfield, also with the Aeronautical Inspection Department; and Harry Leach, a foreman engineer at Cardington. Of the actual working crew, some 42, the most significant included Flight Lieutenant Herbert Carmichael Irwin. R101's captain, he was very experienced and a seasoned flyer, despite being only 36, commanding the R33, R36 and R80 amongst others. As such, he had gained the nickname of Bird. Interestingly, he also participated in the 1920 Summer Olympics in cross-country running. His club still has the Irwin Memorial Challenge Cup. Then there was Squadron Leader Ernest Johnson, navigator; Lieutenant Commander Noel Atherstone, first officer; Flying Officer Maurice Steff, second officer; Maurice Giblett, the Chief Meteorological Officer; George Hunt, Chief Coxswain, nicknamed Sky; William Gent, Chief Engineer; and Spencer Keeley, Chief Wireless Operator. Also of note, showing the quality of her crew, was Chief Steward Albert Savage, formerly with R100, who had joined the airships after a career with the White Star Line as a steward on RMS Olympic, sister ship of the Titanic. Many of the crew had flown with each other in the past and throughout the trials, and were all apprehensive of the trip, a fear apparently justified by the circumstances of her leaving. Under her trials, R101 had been given temporary permits to fly by Sefton Branca. On the 3rd of July, Inspector McQuaid had written directly to the Director of Aeronautical Inspection, wishing to rescind even these temporary permits, fearing the result of experimenting with expanding the gas bag, particularly the effectiveness of padding in preventing holes. Director Outram knew little of airships, so queried it with Colmore, Director of Airship Development, who unsurprisingly played the matter down. R101 was ultimately given a certificate of airworthiness, needed in order to be allowed abroad. But it's telling that despite being signed on the 2nd of October, Irwin only received the finalised copy on the very day she departed. Still listed as an experimental craft, it was later said of its issuing that, quote, a good deal of general thinking and comparison on limited information has been required in reaching our conclusion. First Officer Atherton's diary actually summarises the crew's thoughts both on certification and the pressures they were put under with the tests. Quote, all these window dressing stunts and joyrides before she has got an airworthiness certificate are quite wrong, but there is no one in the RAW, Royal Airship Works, executive who has got the guts to put their foot down and insist on trials being free of joyrides. The day before departure, he wrote, everybody is rather keyed up now, as we all feel that the future of airships very largely depends on what sort of show we put up. There are very many unknown factors, and I feel that that thing called luck will figure rather conspicuously in our flight. Let's hope for good luck and do our best. Lord Thompson, however, optimistically declared shortly before boarding, quote, she is as safe as a house, except for the millionth chance. At 6:34 p.m, the 4th of October 1930, R101 began her maiden voyage. Dropping 4 tons of ballast immediately to counter her heavy load, she circled Bedford before heading south. Forecasts had not been good, although not serious, but it was already raining and getting worse. Already she was pitching slightly, no doubt affecting her gas valve. More disconcerting was the initial altitude of barely 600 feet and speed of only 35 miles an hour, with one engine playing up yet again. Passing over Hitchin, one housewife claimed R101 barely clear breeze, but by 8:21 p.m. when over London, they were stable at 1,500 feet. Messaging to Cardington their intention to head towards Paris, there was no turning back. An hour later, they asked for a weather update before giving a position update at 9:47 p.m. Around 10 o'clock, when over the channel, she dropped to around 750 feet. Atherton took over from the height coxswain and ordered that she not go under 1,000. Taking 2 hours to cross the channel, the faulty engine being restarted, at 11:36 p.m. she reported, crossing French coast at Pointe de Saint-Quentin, wind 245 true, 35 miles an hour. The weather had deteriorated badly by the time she reached Hastings, and once in France, it was abysmal, with low clouds, rain, and southwesterly winds of up to 50 miles an hour. Working at top cruising speed, 63 miles an hour, wind reduced her actual ground speed by half and blew her off course to the east. This was her first time at full speed after her refit, and she had never flown in stormy conditions before. Nonetheless, passengers appeared to have been unconcerned. A message at 12 o'clock to Cardington reading, after an excellent supper, our distinguished passengers smoked a final cigar and having sighted the French coast, have now gone to bed to rest after the excitement of their leave-taking. All essential services are functioning satisfactorily. The crew have settled down to watch-keeping routine. Still 15 miles off course, at about 1 a.m, R101 passed over the hilltop town of Poix-de-Picardy before turning on a new path. It would cross over the 770-foot Beauvais Ridge, an area known for unpredictable turbulence. At 1:51 a.m, Le Bourget wireless station reported her position was near Beauvais. An acknowledgement received at 1:52 a.m. was the last message from R101. Changing shift at 2 a.m, Second Officer Steph and Captain Hunt took over. Battling the storm, progress was slow at only 20 miles per hour as they passed a lone village. At 2:06 a.m., her bow began dipping, ballast being dropped. 1 minute later, she suddenly fell into a steep dive, throwing people and furniture off balance. In 90 seconds, she fell 500 feet as Hunt pulled the elevators hard up and dumped more ballast. At 2:08 a.m., she was back level, but still descending at 290 feet per minute. An altitude of 530 feet, a height not even her length, the engines were slowed. With her nose only 3 degrees up despite the elevators, those in command knew it was all over. Cox and Hunt left the gondola, running through the cruise quarters, shouting, "We're down, lads." After 30 seconds, R101 dove again, and with rigger Sam Church releasing the forward emergency ballast bags, at 2:09 a.m., she hit the ground. A wood 2.5 miles southwest of Beauvais. Traveling at 13.8 miles an hour, at an angle between 15 and 25 degrees, was an almost perfect emergency landing. Although her bow collapsed on impact and the forward starboard engine had been twisted around, this was not a violent landing. She bounced for 60 feet, but the groove dug into the ground by her nose cone was scarcely 9 feet long. But sadly, it wasn't over. With leaking gas bags mixing with air, 5,509,753 cubic feet of hydrogen detonated, one bag after another. The millionth chance had happened. Only one person witnessed the disaster, Eugene Arboulet, who was hunting rabbits. Quote, "I clearly saw the passengers' quarters, well lit, and the green and red lights on the right and left of the airship. Suddenly there was a violent squall. The airship dipped by the nose several times, and its forepart crashed into the northwest edge of the Bois de Cotoum. There was at once a tremendous explosion, which knocked me down. Soon flames rose into the sky to a great height, perhaps 300 feet. Everything was enveloped by them. I saw human figures running about like madmen in the wreck. Then I lost my head and ran away into the woods." Most survivors came from the engine cars, water ballast tanks soaking them as they scrambled free. Foreman Leach from Cardington had been in the smoking room and only escaped by hacking a hole in the wall and jumping through the side of the hull. He landed in a tree where, in his words, "the rain cooled me off." Wireless operator Disley, woken by Hunt, attempted to cut the electrics during the second dive, but failed before he too had to claw out of the burning hull. 8 people got clear of the flames, 2 of whom later died. According to legend, Hunt also got clear, but on seeing that his friend Wally Potter was missing, returned to the conflagration. Neither survived. The 6 who returned home were Arthur Bell, John Binks, Alfred Cook, Arthur Disley, Harry Leach, and Victor Savory. 48 had been killed. Only 5 bodies could be identified, plus another 21 from dental records. The remainder, including Lord Thompson, were never identified. At 3:16 a.m., Le Bourget wireless station sent the brief message, "DFAAW après feu. R101 caught fire." Previously, Disney had to a phone informing the Air Ministry, quote, "She's gone up in flames." Illuminating the night sky, broken and aflame, the maiden voyage was over. Lasting 7 hours, 33 minutes, covering 248 miles. It had been 15 times shorter than that of the Titanic. Excuse me. The dawn of the 5th of October revealed the smoking skeleton sprawled across the hillside. As the survivors were tended to, French authorities surveyed the site, while British investigators were flown in. Such was the faith of the press that only the Express newspaper ran the story that day, but it soon became headline news. After a procession through Beauvais with military cortege, the victims were repatriated on the 10th of October via HMS Tempest and special trains. Laid in state in Westminster Hall, nearly 90,000 people visited to pay their respects during this period of national mourning. In fact, they became the first civilians ever to be laid in state there. On the 11th of October, after a memorial service at St. Paul's Cathedral, the coffins were escorted to Euston Station in a state procession, including a guard of honour, the cabinet and representatives from the Dominions, before being transported to Bedford by train. Walked the final 2 miles to Cardington, they were all interred in a mass grave by the church, in sight of the sheds from where they had departed. Present at this final service, including RAF flyby, ironically by heavier than air vehicle, was Dr. on behalf of. In 1931, a memorial tomb nicknamed the Cenotaph was built, as were memorials near and on the crash site, unveiled in 1933. A plaque commemorating the lying in state was laid in Westminster in November 2014. Amazingly, despite the inferno, R101's RAF pennant was found the next day, still flying from her stern. Recovered, it now stands as a memorial in Cardington Church. An inquiry was held, chaired by politician Sir John Simon. Comprising interviews, expert opinion, including Dr. Eckner's, wind tunnel tests and calculations, it lasted from the 28th of October 1930 to the 27th of March 1931. All the technical witnesses supported the airworthiness of the airship, emphasising that it flew for several hours before suddenly being overwhelmed. But the inquiry must have been hampered, not only by the limited number of survivors, but that many of the most relevant experts were lost in the disaster. There would be, however, one unexpected piece of late testimony. In 1939, Eileen Garrett made headlines by presenting a detailed account of the crash. It made waves because the information was passed to her by the spirit of Flight Lieutenant Irwin during a séance. A reporter was present and the news made worldwide headlines. While the Air Ministry kept quiet, various investigators went through her account, all deciding the content was either common knowledge or nonsense, and that Garrett was a fraud. With the loss of R101, Britain had not only lost many of its top airship experts and supporters, but the country had lost faith in airship travel itself. As a letter by an aeronautical engineer, Howard Roxby Cox, Baron Kings Norton, read, quote, "It is, I am afraid, the end of airships in this country." The scheme was immediately scrapped. The planned R102 to 4 never materialised. The mooring mast at Cardington was demolished in 1941, while that at Karachi was never used by any airship. Cardington remained under the RAF, being used for barrage balloons in World War II, but was later decommissioned. The sheds are now privately owned as film studios. Aside from small fragments, occasionally still found by metal detectorists, R101 did not remain long in the French field. The noted shipbreakers Thomas Ward and Sons were contracted to scrap her, much being turned into pots, pans, and, rather ironically, some commemorative ashtrays. R100, having not flown since the disaster, was ignominiously broken up in November 1931 for the measly sum of £427. Originally intended to cost £1,200,000, the final total of the scheme was £2,396,948 and 48 lives. Now, out of all of the problems found, what had actually caused the disaster? Well, nothing conclusive could be proven, and all affected to some degree, but according to the inquiry, it is believed to have been something like this. By 2 a.m., R101 had been buffeted by storms for hours, soaking her cover. As she got heavier through this and leaks, she became increasingly dependent on her forward motion to give dynamic lift. But this placed increasing aerodynamic force on her bow, an area where the faulty cover had not been replaced. At 2:06 a.m., it began to fail in the wind, forcing her nose downwards through drag before tearing completely, triggering the first dive at 2:07 a.m. Hunt pulled up the elevators, bringing her level, but the dive, coupled to the storm and the exposed gas bags, fatally weakened them and they split. Plainly realising they had a terminal problem, Steph slowed the engines. Less experienced than his colleagues, this action reduced dynamic lift, and the bow, essentially without buoyant hydrogen, fell into the second dive. The cause of the fire remains unknown, the inquiry suggesting electrical wiring, but with hot and damaged diesels crushed into her hull, her faulty engines may have been her final undoing. In fairness to her strength, despite the crash and fire, her framework remained remarkably intact. The true cause will never be known for certain, but with this calamity, Britain was out of the airship age. Overall, the technical reasons were the faulty cover and increasing weight through loss of hydrogen, but there were broader factors. Quoting the inquiry, In the construction of the R101, the designers broke away almost completely from conventional methods. Originality and courage in design are not to be depreciated, but there was an obvious danger in giving too many separate hostages to fortune at one time. Most significant, though, was their comment: the R101 started for India before she could be regarded as having emerged successfully from all the exhaustive steps proper through the experimental stage. This shows the overriding factor. With time, issues could have been fixed, but instead the project was increasingly rushed to meet the Imperial conference. While much of this was due to Thompson, it was more enthusiasm than direct interference on his part, and he was not aware of the full situation. Dowding had been concerned lest Thompson exert pressure, intending to counter this, but found this unnecessary. On the 2nd of October, Thompson said to both him and Colmore, quote, "You mustn't allow my natural impatience or anxiety to start influence you in any way. You must use considered judgment." But those high up within the Royal Airship Works were equally impatient and felt they had much to prove. This was a government-funded project after all. Although not Thompson's fault alone, and despite his claims, political reasoning overtook engineering practice. To quote the inquiry, "It is impossible to avoid the conclusion that the R101 would not have started for India on the evening of 4th of October if it had not been that reasons of public policy were considered as making it highly desirable for her to do so if she could." This was neither the first nor last time that a government would fatally push technology. HMS Captain, Space Shuttle Challenger, to name but two. Later working with record breaker Donald Campbell, survivor Harry Leach went on to say, quote, "One thing the R101 proved is that politics and experimental work don't mix." But contrary to general claims and gross oversimplification, R101 had some good features, R100 some bad. Neither ship was in any way perfect nor commercially practical. The only real reason R100 is seen as superior today is through the fame of her designers and for simply having not crashed. However, while the project cost Britain some of her leading aeronautical experts, Dr. Eckner emphasised the importance of what had been achieved, of construction and mooring techniques, stating, quote, "Airship travel could not be developed without it." But what of the airship dream? Zeppelin services continued, as did American airship development, culminating in the World War II non-rigid blimp design. In the 1990s, a new company, Zeppelin Luftschiffentechnik, was formed. And today, you can still have a flight in an airship. Ardington closed as an RAF base in 2000, and in recent years became the focus for a new generation of experimental cargo airship construction, although sadly this has now since moved away from the historic site. While smaller than their predecessors, these dinosaurs are most certainly not dead. With the loss of R101, the Imperial airship scheme came to an end. But circumstances would mean that R101 would fly again. Approximately 5 tons of wrecked duralumin was purchased by the Zeppelin Company and is believed by some as used in Hugo Eckner's newest ship. Bigger, better, safer. We all know her name, Hindenburg. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Rudi. We go back to thank you very much. Sound varied a bit in times, I'm afraid. Well, certainly when I was hearing it, but I don't think it spoiled the presentation. I don't know if anybody has a question. If anyone wants to type into the chat, or perhaps you want to wave your arm, you need to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
Stunned silence.
Stunned silence.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes.
From Derbyshire. What I can never understand is how they got the airship from its hangar to its mooring point. How did they do that?
It was remarkably simple, to the point that it's almost unbelievable. Quite literally, they would drop a line from the bow of the ship. People would grab hold of it and they would walk the ship out like a dog. And literally, all the local unemployed, men and women actually, judging by some of the photographs, grab hold of the gondola, grab hold of ropes. They would very slowly walk the ship all the way to the mooring mast. There would then be a small amount of ballast dropped, just sufficient for the ship to lift very slightly. A rope would be then connected from the top of the mooring mast to the nose of the ship. And as the airship was lifted up, that would be winched in, bringing her into position. So admittedly, later on, other places did improve this. So for example, Lakehurst, the famous Hindenburg destination, they actually had a miniature mobile mooring mast. As I said, the German airships didn't need a mooring mast for landing, so to speak. And those were built on train tracks, and so those could be moved along. But the vast majority, no, it was walking the dog.
Thank you.
Anybody else got the question?
Can you say where
Did you unmute?
in the world there are?
Sorry, I can't. Sue's speaking.
Sorry, can you repeat?
I was going to ask a question. Where in the world can we see mooring masts today? I've seen one in North Norway, and I believe there was.
I'm afraid you muted yourself just at the end there.
Well, we're losing.
I think
I think, where can we see a mooring mast today? He'd seen one in Norway, but then we lost the end of the question.
Well, the short answer is there are precious few, because of course most airships ultimately didn't need them. To be honest, I didn't actually know that there was one in Norway, so I have to bow to superior knowledge in that regard. All I know for certain is that the vast majority of airship infrastructure generally was largely demolished. You've got the sheds at Bedford, you've got the sheds in Friedrichshafen, I think. They might have actually flattened those ones. Lakehurst, of course. The Karachi one used to still stand, but I think, alas, that's been flattened as well now. So there is precious little, I'm afraid. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much.
Where on earth would you get that quantity of hydrogen from, and how would you handle it?
I could be facetious and say very carefully as far as the handling is concerned. The various locations, so Cardington is a particular example, but similarly there would have been at Karachi and all the main terminals, had gas works specifically designed for the manufacture of hydrogen. So quantity was less of an issue. As for the handling of it, there were a large number of very strict regulations. They had to be very careful. Ultimately, it was effectively piped in, is probably the simplest way of wording it. But to give some examples, there were regular checks of these airships to make sure about leaks. This is how they knew about the leaks on R101 so well, because there had to be regular checks. You had the riggers going about. There were gas detection machines. There's actually one on display in the Science Museum. The irony is that the airship service, probably because they owed more to ships than to aircraft in terms of operation, had very much a nautical tradition behind them. So rather than using all the proper equipment, a lot of the riggers would actually sing chanties as they went around the ship, partially because they could tell where each other was, but more pertinently, if they suddenly went squeaky, they knew they'd found a leak. So, I mean, it's genius, really, if you think about it. So the upshot is that with the handling of hydrogen, there were these unofficial alongside official ways of keeping an eye on it. It was obviously the most dangerous element. Take hydrogen out of the mix, and most airships, frankly, would have been safe. Yeah, gas works, and incredibly gingerly. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Roger, you had a question.
Yes, how can, how did people get into and out of the shape?
In the case of R101, you would enter a lift at the bottom of the mooring mast, go up to the top, and then health and safety would love this in this day and age. There was a hatch which opened downwards from the bow, which had a thin canvas screen on either side acting as fencing. And you just walked across it into a corridor, which then ran from just under the very tip of the bow all the way through down the bottom of the ship into the main passenger accommodation. Now, again, noting health and safety, if you tripped and fell, you just go straight through. It'd have been terrifying if you actually realised that fact. But yes, it was an entrance at the bow, and then you just walk straight down into the main accommodation.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Colin, I think.
Myself?
Yeah.
I was just wondering, clearly we now use helium as for these airships, but of course, although helium is the second most common gas in the universe, on Earth, it's quite a rarity.
Mm-hmm.
So one wonders what future there could possibly be for airships to be developed, when of course, if it's spread much more widely, there would be a considerable problem with helium. I think there used to be, I think the Americans used to have a strategic reserve to try and keep it out of other hands. So what the future is, I don't know, unless there's some ways, perhaps they just don't release it because or whatever. But what there's a bit of a dilemma, I would have thought, for any expansion of the airship industries.
Completely agree with you there. This is part of the reason why America was so cagey in selling helium right at the very start. The Hindenburg, for example, was designed to run on helium. But obviously, for some strange reason, the Americans didn't want to give this potential military technology to the Nazis of all people, so hence hydrogen. Looking to the future, airships, because of their nature, then gas, it can't be controlled. It's a way of reducing height, because obviously you drop ballast to go up, you would release gas to go down. But also, the higher up you are, the more the gas expands, therefore it vents by itself anyway. So there's no way you could recollect it, so to speak. Basically, much as I love the idea of airships, as you quite rightly note, if there was an attempt to go really heavy duty in it, it would only be short-lived in any event, because helium is such a limited element, as you note. The only potential way around that would be if somebody was able to develop effectively a non-flammable hydrogen, a synthetic lighter than air gas. I'm not a chemist. Chances are, I'd have thought that if that was possible, somebody would have already done it. So yeah, it's one of those beautiful pipe dreams, I think, is probably the sad but accurate answer.
There is a lot of helium on the moon, but unfortunately that's still a long way off.
Well, true. Yeah, okay. Well, you never know. If we fix the shuttle and we bring you back in, then maybe we can backtrack to the 1920s.
Chris, Alan Bradstock, may I ask a question?
Certainly.
Rudi, I'm a member of the de Havilland Aircraft Museum, and in our collection we have a 1920s aircraft called a DH-53 Hummingbird that was designed to moor under airships and in flight take off and go back. Are you aware of it, and do you know what airships it would have used?
I am aware of it. Wonderful museum. I've had many a happy visit there, and it's a lovely aircraft indeed, specifically. The short answer is, as a British aircraft, it definitely would have been under the R-33, possibly the R-34. I'm not completely sure. I was actually gifted some official works photographs a couple of years ago of the R-33 in its aircraft carrier format. I don't think it's that type of aircraft. I think it's a predecessor, which is actually in the image, but nonetheless, the fact still stands. The idea of the flying airship carrier is it's one of those wonderful things which sounds balmy off the top of like when just generally said. Very few countries really went in for it. We initiated it, we developed it, the R-33. Again, I think there was a bit with the R-34, but that was basically it. It was the Americans that really perfected it with the Akron and the Macon, with the slightly painful irony that they actually did, talking about the previous question, because it ties in, they did a lot of development of these flying aircraft carriers using helium as the lifting gas. And they had a habit of sailing them willy-nilly into storms. And so the top two, I think it is, worst airship disasters in history were actually both American ships with helium with no fire. So there's a certain irony in there, I think. But yes, indeed, I would need to double check it. The R33 is a definite contender for your aircraft. And again, it's a wonderful museum.
Because the aircraft shortly going to Shuttleworth to have it to be finalised to fly.
Ooh, nice.
The owner is one of our volunteers. He intends to fly it once, then bring it back to the museum, and we're trying to work out how to make a replica section of the airship in the roof with the aircraft suspended underneath.
Oh, that would be good. Well, I think the simple answer there is National Archives could well have some records from the governmental side, because a lot of people do go into them. It's probably only of extremely limited use, but if it is useful, I'd be more than happy to let you have blow-ups of the sections of the photographs I have of the flying aircraft carrier. So even if it doesn't have this specific technicality, you can at least get a context for how it was arranged, if that's any use.
I'll contact you nearer the time. Thank you very much.
By all means, please do.
Any other questions?
I see there's a Mr. Cartledge.
John Cartledge, yes, John.
I wonder if you could just amplify the previous answer. Sorry to be so unimaginative. What's the point of having an airship as an aircraft carrier? What aircraft is it carrying, and what are they doing?
Right. We live in a day when the aircraft seems the dead end and heavier than air is ordinary. Back then, the expectation was the other way around. Heavier than air aeroplanes were faster, they were more maneuverable, but they could only basically do short hops. Therefore, they were good for reconnaissance, but only if you could get it there. Airships were great for long distance, great for hauling large amounts, but they were not the fastest in the world, and they had obvious limitations. So the whole point behind the idea behind the flying aircraft carrier was that you would take your aircraft to near where you want the reconnaissance for, and that could be hundreds of miles away, drop an aeroplane off the bottom of it, that would whiz around, avoid whatever resistance there might be, get your reconnaissance or drop your bombs or whatever you want to do, come back to the airship where it would hook up, reload, refuel and such like. And so you were then able to basically have the aeroplanes doing the short hops, but with the greater distance which an airship would provide.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Any more? Well, thank you very much indeed, Rudi, for another very interesting evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I said earlier, next